The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of Bill C-281, the International Human Rights Act. And let me take this opportunity to commend my friend and colleague, the member for Northumberland, Peterborough South, for championing this important piece of legislation that will strengthen Canada's position to advance international human rights. And the bill will do so in several concrete ways. It strengthens the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act passed by the previous Harper Conservative government. Cluster munitions, of course, having a devastating impact on civilians given their indiscriminate effect. The bill will give additional teeth to Canada's international commitments codified under the Act by restricting investments in entities that are in contravention of the Act. The bill further strengthens international human rights by giving the government tools under the Broadcasting Act to stop the proliferation of foreign propaganda from genocidal regimes. This bill also provides important new reporting requirements on the part of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. More specifically, the bill requires the Minister of Foreign Affairs to annually publish a report on the actions that the government is taking to advance international human rights, as well as to name and provide the background on the plight of prisoners of conscience for whom Canada is seeking to release. This has two positive impacts. First, it enhances transparency and accountability by requiring the Minister of Foreign Affairs to spell out in writing exactly what the government is doing to advance international human rights. And secondly, it provides a platform to shine a light on the individual cases of prisoners of conscience and further to draw attention to human rights abusers responsible for serious crimes. Importantly, this bill provides a new accountability mechanism for the government in the realm of sanctions policy. Pursuant to the bill, if either the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate or the House of Commons recommends the imposition of Magnitsky sanctions against human rights violators, the Minister of Foreign Affairs would be compelled within 40 days to table in Parliament a response indicating the government's position on the imposition of such recommended sanctions, as well as its reasons for imposing sanctions or not imposing sanctions. This, Mr. Speaker, is needed and it is timely, especially having regard for the track record of this government, which for the past several years has failed, has refused to impose Magnitsky sanctions, notwithstanding the fact that there are no shortage of human rights violators, and notwithstanding that Magnitsky sanctions are an important tool in the tools that the government has to sanction human rights violators. For example, when the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations in February 2021 tabled its report, it had a unanimous recommendation that targeted Magnitsky sanctions be imposed on Chinese communist regime officials responsible for serious human rights violations in Hong Kong. The response of the government was to ignore that unanimous recommendation. The Liberals did absolutely nothing. The rationale for why they did nothing, as allies such as the United States impose sanctions, we don't know. The government didn't need to say. They didn't need to provide a rationale. this bill changes that. Hong Kong is not the first time that this government has ignored the will of Parliament with respect to international human rights. A little more than 4.5 years ago, this House voted overwhelmingly to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity. More than 4 years later, and 1,003 days after the IRGC shot down PS 752, killing 176 passengers, including 85 Canadian citizens and permanent residents, this government continues to drag its feet. This government still has not implemented the will of Parliament in designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity. The same IRGC, by the way, that an Ontario Superior Court judge determined committed an act of terrorism in shooting down PS 752. The same IRGC that is arresting, torturing, and murdering peaceful, pro-democracy protesters in Iran as we speak. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister was asked, not once, not twice, but on 4 occasions, by the leader of the official opposition if the IRGC is a terrorist organization. The Prime Minister couldn't bring himself to state the obvious, that the IRGC is a terrorist organization. A total abdication of leadership on the part of this government. Absolutely shameful. But it's not just about designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity. This government has failed to sanction any of the perpetrators responsible for the downing of PS 752. Dr. Ahmed Esmilian, president and spokesperson for the Association of Families of PS 752 victims, appeared before the Subcommittee on International Human Rights in June. And he said that the previous year he hand-delivered, or his association hand-delivered to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, more than 50 names of perpetrators responsible for the downing of PS 752. More than a year later, no action, no Magnitsky sanctions, nothing at all. What is the government's rationale? We don't know. They won't say. This bill is a mechanism that provides some level of accountability. So, Mr. Speaker, what we have over there is a government that is soft on terrorism, that won't even call the Uyghur genocide being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist regime what it is, a genocide. And we have a government that has repeatedly dragged its feet in imposing Magnitsky sanctions on human rights violators who are committing crimes against humanity. And so, in the face of the disgraceful record of this government when it comes to international human rights, at the very least, it is imperative that parliamentary committees have a tool to compel the government to respond and explain their lack of action. This bill does precisely that, and it is why it has my full support.